Personally, I believe now that the Messiah has come, that we all owe belief in fidelity to the Messiah, but we have several biblical stories that transcend cultures. For example, I know this is a bad example because I know you have lots of rebukes to it, but we're going to take it over a continent, is the flood fable, as you would refer to it, or as historians refer to. Fable doesn't mean false, it just means it's way back in the soup of history. But you have the flood fable, which exists in Judaism, and you're going to say, well, this culture and this culture, that doesn't matter. What I'm going to give to you is a story from the Aztecs. Unless the Mormons are right, there's no way that it could have gotten over there. The Aztecs have a flood myth where a man named Noab, or Nota, goes on a giant boat provided by God and saves all the animals, and the flood specifically destroys the giants, just as Genesis 6 notes that the flood destroys the giants and the Nephilim. You have this oddly, eerily similar story coming up in Aztec theology. How would the Aztecs get this remarkably similar story unless it was based on a common ancestral memory?
No, I mean,
how would that happen? I mean, that's a lot of similarities.
No. So you're telling me,
yeah,
that Noah over there in the Middle East got his boat together, right? And got everybody on there, survived the flood and everything like that. And then, obviously there's some genetic fuckery at play here with 8 people repopulating the entire world. But you're going to try to convince me that Noah's family made their way, I guess, back in time, because it obviously had to go back in time in order for the Aztec culture to build up to what it was in that area of the world. So Noah's family went back in time from when the flood occurred to settle in Central America. Hold on, settle in Central America in order to build up the civilization that they had, and they passed down this whole idea of Noah, which turned into Noab, and they built their whole flood myth fable after that. I mean, how hard is it? Like there's that explanation, or there's the explanation of, hey, floods occur. Hey, people build boats. Hey, people store animals on boats and transport them.
I would challenge you to find a flood that was powerful enough to sink the mountains of Mexico. There has never been such a flood. I don't think
that the mountains of Mexico, I'm not
additionally,
sure
by the way, the Aztec
history of that area, but I mean, I don't think that the mountains of Mexico have been flooded, as far as in the modern sense of the mountains of Mexico.
I would note this, is that you do have the Aztecs have this remarkably similar story. The results of this being by chance are teeny tiny. Now, you mentioned the go back in time thing. The Aztec empire didn't really calcify until the 1400s anyways, shortly before the arrival of the Spanish. You had cultural traditions before that, obviously, but I'm noting that there are cultural stories that can survive great cataclysmic events. There are cultural memories that can survive these sorts of things. There are cultural traditions and stories that can survive thousands of years. We know this because we have the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis has survived an incredibly long time. We have a lot of other books of the Bible that have survived this incredible length of history. And so I don't think the Aztecs, were so primitive where they couldn't keep track of things like these so intelligent Mesopotamians. I think they had this happen to them. They happened to write it down, and people continued transcribing it. I mean, you have this sort of thing. I mean, it goes very similar to the Hindu, the Puranas in Hindu mythology. I apologize for the butchering of that name. But you do have this existing as part of the Aztec canon. And the question I would ask you is, why? Why would they include the specific detail about the giants being destroyed by the flood? Why would there be a man and his family who are rescued by God because he's great? Why would there be all of these similarities that line up really remarkably well? I'm not saying there aren't differences. I mean, if I tell a story to 5 different people, I'll get 5 different but corroborating versions of the story. So why would all of these details naturally link up? And after this, we'll go back to morality. We've kind of driven off the rails now, but why? Why are all these similarities?
Well, so first off, when I was mentioning that Noah's family had to go back in time, and travel all the way over to Central America is because we've known that Central America has been inhabited by Homo sapiens for since about 8,000 years ago, which seems to break your whole 6,000 year timeline. Which are you a creationist?
So I'm a 10 to 12,000 years guy. I'm not a 6,000 years guy. Yes, I am a creationist.
Okay. I'm not sure where you get the 12,000 years, but when do you think the flood happened? Did the flood happen 6,000 years, or did it happen later than that?
We have the deluge being pretty early. We have to go before the development of certain parts of Egyptian civilization. We have this kind of mystery of the Sphinx. We don't really know when the Sphinx was built or by who. Some creationists, and you're going to laugh, but this is normal in my community. I'm sorry. A lot of people that I talk to believe that, it is very possible that the Sphinx were built by an antediluvian civilization. I mean, it has water damage on it. That's kind of weird. It's kind of weird that the Sphinx would have water damage on the top of it. So the Sphinx would have to be antediluvian. So we'd have to have the deluge being somewhat before or somewhat after the building of the Sphinx. And we don't really know how old the Sphinx are yet. We have this sort of radiocarbon dating, which is, carbon dating as a whole is unreliable. You have these margins of errors that are massive. You have these massive margins of errors of millions of years. So we don't really know. What they took a sample from like a living penguin, and it came up that it was 8,000 years old. So either we found, Methuselah the penguin, or, there's something a little bit messed up with the dating. Or you can't use it to date recent. Or you can't use what you would say, you can't use it to date recent things. And recent in archaeological terms is these millions and millions of years. And so, you can't
I don't know why you say millions and millions of years like that. Like fucking radiometric dating doesn't work.
It's impossible for radiometric dating to be exact because we can't produce exact conditions of what the atmosphere was like supposedly 12 billion years ago. We don't know what the atmosphere was like back then. You can't reproduce in laboratory conditions how carbon or radiocarbon would interact with the environment. If we're setting it today,
that's not what you would use to date for millions of years.
No, I'm referring specifically to radiocarbon dating. I'm not referring to other types of carbon dating.
Right. And I'm referring to radioactive decay.
We're referring to different things then. And I think my previous
No, we're not. The radiocarbon dating is a type of radioactive dating. There are other types of radioactive dating, but they're all based on radioactive decay. And radioactive decay is well understood, and it's one of the most constant things in the universe. So, I don't think
right now really under the current conditions.
So your suggestion is either radiometric dating is so your suggestion is that physics fundamentally changed at some point in the past magically.
I would absolutely agree with that. I do think though that there is this kind of, now this is a thing that I have with other apologetic people, is that Christianity, we as the Christian religion, fundamentally, we're not necessarily compatible with this sort of relentless Western quest for humans to understand everything. God chose to reveal the absolute truth in the Levant. He chose to reveal this absolute truth to the people, the children of Israel, who had much different philosophical understandings of the world than we as Western humans do today. This desire by a lot of other people in the apologetics community and atheists as well to seek that humans must understand, humans must comprehend everything, is destructive. We need to acknowledge that there are certain things that exist that we do not understand. I challenge you to explain abiogenesis. Can you explain abiogenesis?
You mean abiogenesis?
Yeah, whatever. Abiogenesis, however we're pronouncing it. But you cannot explain the spontaneous occurrence of life. It's never even happened in laboratory conditions.
In laboratory conditions, we've been able to observe the building blocks of life.
You've gotten the nucleotides, but you haven't gotten them to shake hands with each other and say we're a being now.
I feel like you're being pedantically specific here.
Well, it's not pedantic. It's life and not life.
No, you are being pedantically specific, because with abiogenesis, we can understand the mechanisms that would have arisen, or not that would have arisen, but would have caused life to arise. We don't have to exactly reproduce life like in the lab in order to understand the natural processes or the most likely explanation for the appearance of life. I do want to go back to the Aztec flood myth real
Okay.
quick, because you brought that up. I didn't prepare for an Aztec kind of discussion tonight, but luckily artificial intelligence text generators work, and I did ask it some very basic questions. And
I'm glad to know that the big businesses are on your side, good sir.
I'm just saying, like, I'm using Bard right now in case anybody wants to go and look it up. But Bard
to
Bard
please your
uses,
Silicon Valley backers.
I don't have Silicon Valley.
I'm joking, but that's what they are.
So basically, currently what's understood about the Aztec flood myth is that it developed over time, and it's difficult to say when it originated, but it's likely to be influenced by earlier Mesoamerican flood myths, such as the Mayan flood myth. The Mayan flood myth tells a story of how gods destroyed the world with the flood after the people became too wicked. Only a few people survived, and they were able to repopulate the earth.
Hey, that sounds a lot like Genesis.
Right. Sure. The Aztec flood myth shares some similarities with the Maya flood myth. In both myths, the flood is caused by God's anger at people's wickedness.
Yeah, same thing in Genesis.
However, there are also key differences between the two myths. For example, in the Aztec flood myth, the only survivors are a man and a woman who are warned of the flood by the god Tenochtitlan.
Tenochtitlan, something like that.
Yeah, they were able to survive by hiding in a hollow tree. The Aztec flood myth is likely to have developed in the centuries leading up to the Spanish conquest in 1521, but it is possible that the myth was influenced by the arrival of the Spanish, who also brought their own flood myth. But still, these very common attributes that you assign to it don't necessarily mean that there was like a worldwide flood and the knowledge of it was propagated by Noah and his family who inhabited the rest of the earth.
I would say that that's not necessarily correct, because you have a story that's very common throughout human civilization.
Right.
Your propensity is to say, hey, wait a minute, something might have happened.
It's easy to fabricate, oh, everybody's being shitty. Oh, God flooded the world because everybody's being shitty. Oh, how are there still humans? Oh, well, a few people survived and they fucked themselves silly and repopulated the earth. Oh, that makes total sense in my very primitive mindset. Like,
well, I mean, that's a very weird
story to create.
Well, number one, we have to completely discard this idea that ancient people were some sort of like knuckle dragging primitives. They weren't. They were rational individuals just like you or I. The fact that they didn't have access to what we have doesn't mean that they were dumb. It means they existed with a different.
I feel like there's a pretty large gap in rationality between our mindset now, modern mindset, and the mindset of people in the 1400s or earlier than that.
I wouldn't necessarily say that's true. I say they existed in a different world with different sets of assumptions, different societal norms, and different understandings of how the world worked, based on their own observations and based on their own experiences. It is not my position to say that those experiences and what they observed as a result of things that they were doing, things that they could actually test that were happening, were invalid because they didn't understand the properties that surrounded them. I think that's a very dangerous slope. That leads into, that's a very Western mindset. It's very paternalistic in a sort of sense. These pasts were full of primitive people. This isn't true. The pasts were filled with normal people, just like you and I, that had different sets of societal functions. I mean, this is just, it's very weird to kind of say the past, these people were primitive. It's not accurate to say. And I must warn you this, so you don't use it in the future, is that is the mindset that empires use when coming into contact with primitive people, is saying, oh, these people are idiots because they don't know where this comes from, and we need to teach them. The past wasn't filled with these. I know, but that's where that set of assumptions comes from.
I did not say that they were idiots. I said that they were incredibly gullible.
You said they were primitive.
Well, they're primitive compared to our understanding of reason and rationality now. Like,
maybe. I don't know. I think if I went to somebody in Plato's Academy and asked him to explain rationality, and I asked the average Joe on the street, I think the guy from Plato's Academy would do better. Even if I took an honors student from my Augusta University over here in philosophy and asked him to explain a concept, and I took somebody from Plato's school, I still think the guy from Plato's school might be a little bit more educated about it. I don't think that these people in the past were limited by anything else than their circumstances.
I think that the ability to reason was not as widespread, and so that results in the majority of the populace not being that educated to be in Plato's school. Like, do you think just like everyday people attended Plato's fucking
No, that's
school?
why I said it. That's why I changed it from a person on the street to somebody here at the University of Michigan or someone even at Harvard or Yale. I modified that because I knew that this would mollify the complaint that I know you bring. Somebody actually commented something that I would agree with. And yeah, I would say that they were limited by their working body of knowledge. I wouldn't disagree with that assertion. I'm sorry to that commenter that I had to agree with them and ruin his evening. But